180.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Senator Erickson.
My name is Ron Erickson, Senate District 47, Southeast Missoula, including the University of Montana. I'm bringing Senate Bill 180 for your attention today. I'll first of all say that this is not a carbon sequestration bill. It is a bill that deals with carbon dioxide. We could talk about it in many terms, including the title that you have in front of you. I talk about it in terms of tailpipe standards. Some others might talk about it as keeping Detroit honest. And that's not a bad title either. Mr. Chairman, I have a particular kind of handout for you. Chairman, I'll wait till that gets all the way around, but I'll get started by saying that when last summer I asked for this bill to be drafted, I didn't know exactly what to expect. I thought we might see some fairly complex language in a bill, and what you see is that we have an incredibly simple bill that is impossible to understand, right? The heart of the bill says, on lines 23 and 24, before January 1st, 2010, the board shall adopt vehicle emission standards that meet the requirements of Section 177 of the Federal Clean Air Act. And I'm told that that's the way this particular legislation was passed in Maine when it was last passed in that state. And I should say now that this legislation has been passed in over a dozen states. So the handout that I've just given you gives you the reference to Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. And there we see that any state can set standards, and then 1 and 2. Such standards, if such standards are identical to the California standards for which a waiver has been granted for such model year, and California and such state adopt standards at least 2 years before such model year. I think the federal legislation is often written even worse than ours, but the idea of that is that states can go to a different standard than the federal standard, but only one, California standard, and that standard is always going to be for a model year a couple of years out, right? So we give the industry time. I'd like to give a little bit of history. I don't know if many of you have been to Southern California. I remember first flying into Southern California in the late 60s, where you weren't sure whether there was a city below you because of the brown air. Congress gave California the right to set their own tailpipe standards more than 30 years ago, and they did. Over time, other states with major air pollution problems for the criteria of pollutants, that's usually nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, particulate, ozone, etc., sulfur dioxide. The other states were allowed to come into those standards, those tailpipe standards, and that's what the federal law has. In 2002, California began to worry about greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, and they began the process to argue for calling carbon dioxide a pollutant. And you jump to 2007, the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. The minute the Supreme Court decided that, then they said, okay, we want to regulate tailpipe standards, which is sort of like making sure you're getting good gas mileage. Okay, that's all tailpipe standards would be for carbon dioxide. We want to have the right to regulate carbon dioxide from the tailpipe. They went to the Bush administration. The Bush administration said no. This week, Monday, the Obama administration has said to the EPA, move ahead with this. They didn't say, yes, do it right now. They said, look at this for the future. So the bill I bring you today is up to date. It's just a recent event, as recently as Monday. There are many people here today to testify both for and against. Let me try to give a quick answer to the question, why Montana? Why ought we do it? Yeah, there have been a dozen other states, and many of them are near us, the West Coast states, New Mexico and Arizona, for example. In order to answer why should Montana do this, for me the quick answer is, well, why did California want to do it? It's not photochemical smog. When California went to the Supreme Court, they mentioned a couple of things. They've got a coastline, and they would like to see that coastline stay steady. They have snow in the Sierras, and they want that snow to continue to give water for their agricultural systems. We in Montana ought to be concerned, first of all, about Montana. And we ought to be concerned for, and I give you a great paper by Steve Ronning, one of the Nobel Prize winners, University of Montana, talking about forest fires and how forest fires in this state are connected to climate change. Or anybody in any part of the state who thinks about drought, and drought having to do with climate change as well. So we ought to be concerned in Montana, for Montana. We also ought to be concerned for the planet as a whole. I'm going to sit down now, listen to testimony, and be ready for questions later. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Erickson. How many proponents do we have for this bill? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10. Well, so it's going to allocate about an hour for this hearing, and so with 10 of you and approximately 20 or 25 minutes, you need to try and keep your remarks to it. 2 to 3 minutes. Proponents, please come forward.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, my name is Eric Stern, for the record, Senior Counselor to the Governor. I just want to come and briefly state our strong support for this bill.
Pick that up just a little bit.
Better?
There you go.
All right.
That'll
Wanted to express the Governor's strong support for this measure. As you know, the auto companies just received a very generous bailout, and they made a promise that they were going to make more fuel-efficient cars. I don't believe that the promise is made in writing, but I think that this measure is a way, indirectly perhaps, but an important way, to make them follow through on their promise. As Representative Erickson detailed, it regulates a series of pollutants, one of which is CO2, and it has the indirect advantage of requiring cars to be more efficient. And that means another weapon against climate change, and yet another way that Montana can be active in achieving energy security for America. So I would urge you to support it. Paul Cartwright's also going to testify from our office. He's detailed to our office from DEQ. He can give you technical support on the issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. Further proponents?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Paul Cartwright, and today I'm testifying on behalf of the Governor's office. Just to expand some on what Senator Erickson said, California and 13 states have adopted these standards contingent on the federal waiver being granted. Also, 2 Canadian provinces has. It's about 40% of the North American market or population is in right now. The standards don't cover all vehicles. It's passenger vehicles up to 10,000 pounds and trucks up to 8,500 pounds. So the effect on the ag and construction sectors will be fairly minimum. The standards mainly increased efficiency, but cause increased efficiency, but they also improve the air conditioning, reducing the leakage. So I have some handouts here if I can pass them around.
You're welcome to, yes.
These have the numbers, or more numbers than you want, because the standard is actually in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per mile. It's a good thing. But the basic thing is they're using existing technology, which you'll see on pages 2 and 3, and there are separate standards for the trucks and for passenger cars. The standards for trucks allow about 50% more greenhouse gases than for passenger cars, and it's for the fleet, so you can average over, if you want to buy a Hummer, you can still buy a Hummer under California standards. Just there won't be as many on the market as there have been. The clean cars do cost more. Go to what are described as the 2016 standards, which are the label they used when the California bill was originally passed. That would be pushed back a couple years because of the delay in the waiver. But those standards would increase the car cost over business as usual by about $1,000 or $20 a month on your loan. The savings in gasoline are predicted to be for most cars, but on average, they're predicted to be greater than the cost of the loan. So from day one, you may well be saving money under the California standards. And California, by the way, used $1.74 in their gas calculations. Since this is about climate change, I at least have to mention it, but that's, as Senator Erickson mentioned, is not the key reason why we're here. But you know, the climate's going to do what it does, no matter what any of us think. One way or another, it's going to do it. The things that have me concerned personally are that there are changes happening, and you can spin them different ways. If you listen to NASA, 2008 was the coldest year in this century, or the 9th warmest in the last century and a half. I just get a little more worried if you took the long view. And there's also problems just with the carbon dioxide making the oceans more acidic, and by 2050 we may be out of coral and shellfish, so no more scallops. The thing that you have to remember is that the first impact will not be, it's a little bit warmer, but more extreme events. And if you go to the pages in the back, you'll see charts on the snowfall, winter snowfall in some of the cities around Montana, the March temperature, and then finally of interest to me, in Helena, the number of degrees of days with more than 90 degrees. It's all getting worse. Some of you are ranchers and farmers in the legislature. You know, you tell me what that means. It looks serious. Like I said, that's not the reason that I think this bill deserves support. The main reason is, I can read here, in their submission to the Senate in December 2nd, 2008, General Motors said it would achieve 2012 fuel economy levels of 37.3 miles per gallon and 27.5 miles per gallon in the new cars and light truck fleets, respectively. Ford has said they can raise their average fuel economy by 26% in 2012 and 36% in 2015. According to studies that have been done, or analysis that was done, these are pretty close to California standards. So what I think we have is 17.4 billion reasons for wanting to pass this legislation. The car companies have gotten this money. They promised increased efficiency. There's no way of holding them to it unless we have these kind of standards. If the states adopt this kind of standard, I think you'll see one fleet standard for the entire continent, and it'll be the California one. That's why we want to support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cartwright. Further proponents, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Jonathan Matthews. I live here in Helena, teach at Carroll College. I'm also on the executive committee of the Montana Sierra Club, and representing the 2,000 Montanans who are members of the Montana Sierra Club, I'd like to support this initiative, this bill. Some things that haven't been mentioned. The governor's task force on greenhouse gas found that increasing efficiency of automobiles is the most cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gases, and in fact it will return on average $100 per person per year, over any expense, and that's a nice thing to consider. I have in my hand here, this is a paper, the Helena Record, our paper here in town, and we have side by side the article about Obama, President Obama, saying to the EPA to move forward with these higher, perhaps allowing these higher efficiency standards, alongside with the article on climate change, saying that even if we were to go back to pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide immediately, that the effects of the CO2 currently in the atmosphere and the heat loading in the oceans would cause the effects of climate change to last for another 1,000 years. And the scientists, this is from the National Academy of Sciences, the top top scientists in this area, and they're saying basically the implications for policymakers such as yourselves is we need to act now. It's past time for any kind of delay. And if this is the most cost-effective way to address this issue, and in fact will give the average Montanan $100 extra per year, and it will hold the automakers who got our billions of dollars recently to the things they claim they will do, I think it's a great thing, and I hope you'll support it. 87% of Montanans in a random poll recently said that they support the idea of higher efficiency, higher mileage vehicles from the automakers. So this is not something just that the members of the Sierra Club support, it's something that the average Montanan supports overwhelmingly. So I hope you will go ahead and pass this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matt.
I'm sorry, I also have some materials I would just like to leave with you.
Okay, thank you. Further proponents?
Chuck McGraw, representing the Natural Resources Defense Council and Renewable Northwest Project. And McGraw is spelled M-A-G-R-A-W. I'm not here today to talk about global warming or greenhouse gas emissions per se. Let's talk about some other things in connection with this bill. Why we're supporting this bill is because it strikes a blow for energy independence and will save Montanans literally hundreds of millions of dollars. For far too long, we have been held hostage by an automobile industry that has been unwilling to produce vehicles that are efficient. These standards are achievable and they are highly cost effective. And in this regard, I'd ask you to keep in mind if there are assertions from the industry that these standards cannot be achieved, that this is precisely what the industry said about increasing CAFE standards. CAFE standards are corporate average fuel economy standards for over 30 years. And the industry was indeed saying this as recently as 2 years ago. Yet, in December 2007, with the passage of the Energy Independence and Security Act, the industry was okay with significantly increased CAFE standards. You might also hear that there is no reason for these standards with the passage, because of the passage of the Energy Independence and Security Act. In other words, we've done all that we need to do. Well, first, I'd ask you to notice the irony here that after fighting improved CAFE standards for over 30 years, the industry is now using the passage of increased fuel efficiency standards and the enactment of the Energy Independence and Security Act as a shield. But leaving that aside, the argument fails because there's so much more that can be achieved with respect to increasing fuel efficiency in vehicles. With the passage of these standards in 2020, an average vehicle will get 42 miles per gallon. Under the Energy Independence and Security Act, that vehicle will get 35 miles a gallon. That's a significant increase in fuel efficiency, a significant advantage, and something that will produce benefits to across in the entire economy. So, very simply, there is no reason not to support the passage of this bill and the adoption of these standards, and there's every reason to do so. What it will mean is that our cars and trucks will burn more cleanly, will use less fuel, and will reduce the amount that we spend at the pump. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. McGraw. Further proponents?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Ann Hedges with the Montana Environmental Information Center, and we also strongly support this bill. In 1971, when Henry Ford II and Lee Iacocca met with President Nixon, they said that shoulder harnesses, airbags, and headrests were going to be devastating economically to the auto industry. Now people are looking for cars that have side airbags. Those measures not only were responsible and prudent, but now they're a selling point for vehicles. You know, the cars have to have airbags, but people won't buy cars that don't have side airbags now. So this recommendation is the single most cost-effective recommendation of the Governor's Climate Change Advisory Committee. Senator Perry sat on that committee. They went through hundreds of ideas. They whittled it down to 54, and this came up as the single most cost-effective recommendation for Montanans. This will reduce emissions by 4.2 million metric tons by 2020. That will result in saving Montanans $500 million. So EPA this week decided to start moving forward again with granting the California's waiver. What is going to happen is there are a number of states like Utah and Colorado that when EPA denied the California waiver, those states' efforts to adopt this standard stalled out. They believe, talking to people in those states, that those efforts are going to be reinvigorated now that the EPA is moving forward with allowing California to set this standard. What you're going to see is not only 13 states, you're going to see a number of other states who are going to be moving forward. Right now, the estimate is anywhere between 17 and 20 states are going to be poised to move forward by the time EPA grants that waiver. What will happen if we do not adopt a standard like this is Montana could become a dumping ground for inefficient vehicles. And that doesn't make sense for Montanans, and it doesn't make sense for our pocketbooks. I would urge you to move forward with the rest of the country towards making these auto dealers be more efficient and help us save money every couple weeks at the pump. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Just further proponents?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Mason Giem, and it's G-I-E-M for the record. I come to you as a fourth-generation Homestead Montanan and a graduate of Beaver County High School and a current student at the University of Montana, where I sit on the vice president of the board of directors for Montberg. I come to you to ask you, not in the big numbers as everybody can throw at you, but as a plea for our own air and for our future to be clean and healthful. And I think that this measure will be an important step in helping create a clean and healthful environment as is in our Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Is there further proponents? Are there further proponents?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Jay Menenga from Roberts, Montana.
Would you spell that last name, please?
M-E-N-N-E-N-G-A. I'd like to provide you an example of how this bill would help local governments purchase more energy-efficient vehicles. I live close to Red Lodge, and last year the mayor adopted the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, along with unanimous support from the council. And so Red Lodge has joined 3 other Montana cities, Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula, to implement that. And that agreement, you're probably familiar with it, but it calls for reducing greenhouse gases 7% below the 1990-91 levels. That's the Kyoto Protocol. In order to help the council, I formed a Citizens Climate Protection Group. And what we've been doing is meeting to talk about ways to implement the Climate Protection Agreement. We've come up with a lot of ideas, and the mayor has already said that anytime there's going to be a new vehicle purchased, she will make sure it's energy efficient. And so I believe that this bill would help the mayor and probably other local communities to adopt guidelines for more energy efficient and less polluting vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menenga. Further proponents?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Casey Perkins. I'm here today representing Montana Audubon, and I'll be really brief again. We think this is a very important issue, and we strongly support this bill, and would like to thank the sponsor for carrying it.
Thank you, Ms. Perkins, for your short
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I will beat you in shortness. I would also like to ask you to support this bill and thank the sponsor.
What was your name?
Oh, sorry. Helena Louder. I'm from Missoula.
Thank you, Ms. Lauder. Further proponents? Further proponents? Seeing none, do we have any opponents? How many opponents actually do we have? About the same. So 2 to 3 minutes apiece for each of you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Lori Dooley, that's spelled D-O-O-L-E-Y, and I'm here today on behalf of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. The Alliance is a trade association representing 11 car and light truck manufacturers, both domestic and international. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to speak with you and encourage you to oppose Senate Bill 180, which allows for the implementation of the California Low Emission Vehicle Program, which we call CALEV as the acronym in the industry. I thought it would be important just to take a quick moment and actually explain to you the three components of the California standards. The first component is a low emission vehicle program, otherwise known as LEV-2. LEV-2 regulates smog and ozone forming emissions coming out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. The second component is a zero emission vehicle mandate, which is essentially a mandate on battery powered and hydrogen electric vehicles. And again, that's aimed to reduce the smog and ozone forming emissions coming out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. Now, these two smog and ozone forming emissions programs, as part of CALEV, provide no measurable environmental benefit above and beyond the federal Tier 2 program, which Montana is already adhering to. Often the adoption of the CALEV standards are painted as an effort to clean the air. However, that misrepresents the benefit of the California program. The California program and the federal program are right on par with each other, and both are expected to produce about a 70% reduction in tailpipe emissions. It's the third component, or the proposed fuel economy standards, that is why we're essentially here today. These standards are also referred to as greenhouse gas emission standards, AB 1493, or the PABRI standards. Current law does not allow the state of Montana or the state of California, or any other state for that matter, to actually implement those laws at this point in time. Now, the auto industry shares the goals of SB 180, essentially a clean environment, energy independence, and a greatly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. We just disagree on the methods. The Alliance strongly supports an aggressive, comprehensive, and national approach to the climate change issue, as opposed to the California standards, which we believe will result in product restrictions, will virtually eliminate any incentives to produce E85 vehicles, will relinquish Montana's authority to the state of California, and which will establish a patchwork of constantly changing regulations in the state. It is because of this belief that we did support the Energy Security and Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 in Congress. The centerpiece of this act, which is known as ESA, requires automakers to achieve an unprecedented minimum 40% increase in corporate average fuel economy standards, which will result in a minimum decrease of 30% in CO2 emissions. And it's important to highlight that word minimum because NHTSA and the other agencies that regulate ESA are required to push those standards even higher should they see that the technology is available to the auto industry. So just to quickly go over some of the things that have happened in the last week that have been alluded to. On January 26th, President Obama did direct DOT and NHTSA to quickly finalize these new CAFE standards, particularly in relation to model year 2011. They need to do that before March 30th to hit targeting lead time deadlines that the industry needs to meet those standards for those model years. Additionally, President Obama directed NHTSA and the Department of Transportation to thoroughly review proposed standards for subsequent model years, and that should go through 2015. They've decided to promulgate rules from 2011 to 2015 first, and then go back and republicate rules for 2015 through 2020. Now, the rules that have already been proposed and are on the table are actually more stringent than the California standards if you look at the rules in the aggregate, looking at light trucks and passenger cars at the same time. It's about a 4.5% annual increase in the corporate average fuel economy standards during those 5 years. The auto industry shares President Obama's urgency in finalizing these standards because we do believe it is the appropriate mechanism to reducing transportation sector greenhouse gases. Now, when ESA was passed, US EPA did deny California's waiver to implement their own fuel economy standards, and that's the action that prohibits California and all the other states from implementing their own standards. On the 26th, President Obama did direct EPA to review their decision on the waiver. However, that outcome definitely remains in question. And the president's assurance that he's seeking, quote, a comprehensive approach that makes our economy stronger and our nation more secure, positively reflects the auto industry's position that ESA is the appropriate mechanism to regulate greenhouse gases. Just a few reasons why we think California standards would not be right for the state of Montana. The California program will result in product restrictions. You're probably asking why we think ESA is better than the California standard across the country. The answer is simple. The way that the California program is put together, it shows increases that are far too aggressive and far too quick of a time span for auto industry manufacturers to meet the standards that are promulgated. So the only cost-effective way to comply is essentially to restrict the sale of certain vehicles within the state of Montana, and this will mean limited availability on light trucks and the SUVs that Montana residents like to drive. Significant reductions in those types of vehicles will disproportionately impact Montana because of your current sales mix in the state. We approximate that it's approximately 66% trucks to 34% cars in Montana. So in order to do that, you'll have to conform to California standards, and they have a sales mix of approximately 46% trucks to 54% cars. So a national standard really allows the auto industry to balance states like Montana that prefer trucks against states like California that prefer cars, but have the same overall outcome. Finally, the adoption of California standards does not support certain alternative technologies like E85 or ethanol fuels. In 2008, there were about 30 models of flex fuel vehicles available for sale across the country. Only 19 of those models were available in California or other California states. So it's a product restriction that you see under CalEv, and we predict if they take their regulations in the direction which they plan to go, that product restriction may become even more significant. And finally, Montana should not cede its regulatory authority to California. As California continues to change the regulations, Montana would be obligated to make the exact same changes to their regulations as well. Montana is a much different state than California, and it shouldn't tie itself to all of the future regulatory changes that California makes. ESA applies a high standard to all 50 states that's good for consumers and energy security, and we ask that you allow our experts the opportunity to work towards those goals the federal government had set without the burden of complying with individual state regulations. We urge you to vote no, and I'll be available for questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Ms. Dooley, for the response.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Bruce Spencer. I represent the Montana Automobile Dealers Association. We are the folks that get the vehicles the manufacturers make. I heard the comment earlier on that this bill will make the auto dealers more efficient, force them to be more efficient. We're at the mercy of what comes down the pike, and that's why I'm rising in opposition to this bill. You have heard, quite correctly, that if this bill passes, the allocation of vehicles to Montana will change. And what that means is mixture of cars to trucks. They don't sit down when they determine a CAFE standard or whether you're going to meet this emission standard and do it on a vehicle-by-vehicle basis. They look at the overall fleet. Now, I think you folks know your constituents. And I think you know that they want to drive pickups and SUVs. You heard the figure 66%. I've had dealers tell me that their dealerships sell 70 to 80% pickups and SUVs. If you take those vehicles away from us, what are we going to sell? It's not what the Montana consumer wants. They don't want a Yugo. Another problem with doing this is that there's no prohibition from someone from Montana going over to my good friend Dave Smith in Idaho and buying their pickup there and bringing it back to Montana. So in addition to having to sit at the Grizzly games and listen to his advertisements, which make my members upset, they're now going to see a giant billboard at that game that says, "Can't get your pickup in Montana? Come on over to Idaho." We don't want to do that. It's a serious problem for my clients. It could conceivably put them out of business. And they are not the ones that manufacture the vehicles. They're the tail end. But they are the ones that support the softball teams and the baseball teams and the bowling leagues and the charities in your local communities. This bill will hurt them. The market actually resolves some of the problem in terms of at least the amount of gas that a vehicle uses. We all lived through the $4 gas prices, and now we're back down to, it was $1.70 when I filled up the other day. Let me give you a little vignette. I tried to get a dealer to come in, but they just weren't available. During our legislative dinners around the state, some dealers got up and told some stories about what was happening with the gas prices fluctuating up and down. And when it was $4 a gallon, our Toyota dealers couldn't get enough Priuses. 20, 30 people lined up on the waiting list to get them. Couldn't get them in fast enough, couldn't sell them fast enough. As soon as gas dropped below $2 a gallon, they can't give those cars away and they're sitting on their lots. All the orders are canceled. And those people that are buying cars now want trucks and SUVs. What it shows is that the market fixes these problems. The consumer will respond to a gas price if it's high or low enough. And this type of legislation is not necessary. You should also know that this particular these standards don't cover every single manufacturer. There are 6 or 7 manufacturers that aren't governed by these, and so they don't have to comply with it. And what that does in terms of my clients is it could present some of my dealers an economic advantage because they don't have to comply with the California CAFE standards versus the other manufacturers who do, and they're getting their product at a lower price and because of a governmental regulation, not because of market factors, and that creates problems. The other part of the California standard is that they have to present zero emission vehicles in the state. Let me explain how that happens. The bill passes and my good friends, the manufacturers, and I'm not really trying to pick on them, will call up my clients and say, we have 2 electric cars and you're going to take delivery of them. And guess what? They only charge for 30 miles or 40 miles. It's not going to sell in this state. It's a problem. Montana shouldn't be regulated by California. My dealers shouldn't have to comply with a California law that has nothing to do with Montana. And your constituents, this is what my dealers are telling me, want to buy pickups and SUVs. And if this passes, the manufacturer is simply going to say to us, you aren't going to get pickups and SUVs, and they'll go over to Idaho and get them. So we urge a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Further opponents? And I'll make a note that the last 2 presenters used most of the time for the opponents, so this time you need to speed up.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I don't think I could speak any faster than Ms. Dooley.
Very good.
And I'll keep my comments short. I'm going to take a little bit of different approach. My name is Mona Jameson, Jamison, and I'm here representing General Motors. I'd like to put this in a slightly different context. I want you please to, we stand in opposition to this bill for a number of reasons. You've heard them, and Ms. Dooley forgot some handouts and they're being distributed. You heard all of the reasons from her, some are quite technical. The first question I want to pose to the committee is this. Why, as a matter of public policy, are you going to delegate this entire area to California? California will change its rules, its standards, and under that section of the Clean Air Act, if you adopt this, you are bound to do everything California does. No public hearings for Montanans. They won't be heard. You'll just follow suit. Now, California's standards may or may not make sense for California. Sounds like they do. California has serious non-attainment issues. Perhaps that works for them. Why do we want to cloak ourselves in what California needs to do for California in Montana? Now, you heard the automobile industry, when Ms. Dooley testified, is not opposed to better standards in these areas, is working on them, and whether we call it a shield or not has been referred to. They're bound by the law, and they're moving forward on these standards. The irony is, even though GM supports a national standard, if the EPA does this, and they are beginning, everybody then, all the states have an opportunity to comment and to be heard. And hopefully what would come out of that are rules that are apropos to each state and yet reach the results that everybody wants. So I think that that is a fundamental policy decision, is a delegation to California to tell Montana what to do in this area when our air is different, our conditions are different, and we don't have an LA here, and we don't have that kind of a non-attainment area. The other thing I'd like to discuss that I don't think has really hit home, you've heard it alluded to. The federal fuel economy standard is based on what's called a reformed basis, with separate standards for each size class. And that reformed approach encourages all size classes to remain in the fleet, which has to do with vehicle selection, including full-size pickups and SUVs with the fuel economy improvements coming from the application of new technology. The California program is on what's called an unreformed basis, fleet-wide average. This approach encourages the downsizing and the downweighting of vehicles. Those two different approaches affect the kind of cars that our dealers will get. And this is a state that for business purpose, agricultural purposes, that's why it's 66% trucks. Not for fashion, not because it's in to take your kids to the soccer games in the SUVs, because this is what Montanans need to live. Going to California means you're going to fall into that reform basis. And that's why you've heard these discussions about the kinds of cars you're going to get. It will be, rather than over the fleet-wide, California's the fleet-wide average. You've heard that it will affect E85s, the flex fuel vehicles, and you've also heard what the dealers, what Ms. Dooley's organization is saying could result in increases up to $3,000 a vehicle. The debate here is not about increasing the standards for the vehicles. That is happening, the laws are in motion, and it's going to be a reality. I think the question is, are you going to be in control of it, at least going through rulemaking and being heard at the federal level, or are you going to just let California take over? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jamison. Further opponents, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Ronna Alexander representing the Petroleum Marketers Association, who are wholesalers, distributors, and retailers of motor fuel products in Montana. Our concern comes from a little bit different perspective. This will be brief, and it's about a concern that we have that this opens things up to a whole different perspective than what I think even the sponsor probably intends. And after talking to my counterpart in California last night, I do believe it has this potential. If you look at, on the fiscal note, at assumptions 2 and 3, you're not just talking about vehicle gas emissions, you're talking also about greenhouse gas emissions. And if that waiver was granted, within that standard, that California standard, are actual fuel criteria standards. And I couldn't tell you where exactly or what page, but I believe this could have the potential of allowing a board of 7 people to actually say what kind of fuel that could be sold in the state and where. And obviously we think that those kind of far-reaching policy decisions should be made by the legislature. So we would ask the committee, perhaps this is not the case, there's a lot of confusion here about this, but we would ask the committee to ensure that that is not the case if you are so inclined to adopt this bill. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Ms. Alexander. Further opponents, please. Senator Stang, you know the program on telephone.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the record, I'm Spook Stang, Executive Vice President of the Montana Motor Carriers, and I am sure that the chairman will bring a list of the treats that this committee would like home with him tonight, so I can take care of that. I apologize for the phone. We go in opposition to Senate Bill 180, and I've heard all the proponents and talk about car standards, but there are also some CARB and EPA regulations that are on hold right now that do affect semi-trucks going into California. And those regulations have had a substantial effect on the trucking industry in California and my members that deliver to California, many of those do not enter California anymore. They stop at the Nevada border and recontract with somebody from California to carry the goods because we just can't afford to buy the trucks to keep up with how fast they change their standards.
Thank you, Mr. Stang. Further opponents?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the record, Don Allen on behalf of WEDA, the Western Environmental Trade Association. I just want to make one point, and that is what our concerns are in terms of the possible use of the bill at some point to be used to limit industrial and commercial services. In other words, right now we're talking about vehicle emissions, but what we're concerned about, could it be adapted at some point to go after stationary type sources? So other types of facilities, those kinds of things, we're concerned about that. It's our understanding that there may be an amendment to clarify that, but the fiscal note does refer to that point, and so we do want to see it clarified, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Further opponents? Further opponents? Seeing none, do we have informational witnesses? Any informational witnesses? Seeing none, questions from the committee? Senator Watson,
Mr. Chairman, for the sponsor. Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, would you care to give us your response to the notion that we are ceding our authority to California and allowing it to have control over what happens in our state, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Watson Reed, the press is to make something that's nationwide. It was mentioned about Colorado and Utah. There's already bills going on in Texas and Hawaii as well. What we hope to be able to do is to push this so that we can get a nationwide system. Now, obviously, what Ms. Jamison talked about was that you've got some input when the feds do it. Well, I would argue that the CAFE standards that come out from the feds are as firm as firmness that we get from California. So we're going to have some new standards coming down one way or the other. I think the California standards are the better ones, and that we're going to be able to see that happening quite soon. I could say some more about the rest of the California standards, but that wasn't your question.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. Well, what about those other standards that California has that you might otherwise want to explain? Could you briefly summarize your concerns in that area as well?
Yes, I would. I used to teach air pollution courses at the University of Montana. I can remember taking students in an environmental chemistry class at the biological station at Flathead Lake. We could go out on the road that you know next to the biological station and measure ozone concentration. Ozone is not normally a pollutant in Missoula, but in Montana, Flathead Lake, but in fact there's enough to do some damage. What we have is a federal law called the Clean Air Act, which sometimes gets referred to as the Partially Dirty Air Act. What we do is we try to set some standards, but in fact there is no standard at which something like ozone doesn't do some damage. I took those same students across to Wild Horse Island, and you can finally find a place where there aren't any cars where in fact there's no ozone. But all of the kinds of criteria pollutants that California regulates are pollutants in this state as well. And yes, we usually meet all the standards. Once in a while there's a city that has a problem, usually because of cars. But we can be better off if we have all of the California standards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Perry.
The sponsor, please.
Chairman, Senator Perry.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, you threw me on that last comment. There's no ozone on Wild Horse Island?
When I took my students and measured it, I can find it anytime there are cars around. And it's sunlight. You gotta have sunlight in cars, and you can find very low concentrations most places. At least with the measurements that I was able to make back in 1973, this was. I didn't find any on Wild Horse, where there are no cars.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, the brown haze that you mentioned in your opening in Southern California, was that due to carbon dioxide?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Nitrogen dioxide is why it's brown.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, are you familiar with France? What is the situation with the emissions in France? Would you consider them on a par with California, or worse, or better?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perry, I have no knowledge of France. I've been there once, but it was a long time ago.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, are you familiar with the car Peugeot?
Oh, yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Perry. I also am familiar with the Renault. Renault, yeah, that's what I had, one of those ones. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, do you recall that Peugeots haven't been imported to the United States since about '92?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Perry, I didn't know that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, I recall that the reason was that they don't meet California standards. And it is of concern to me. I happen to like a Peugeot. They're really popular in Paris, all over France, in fact. And if the current technology that Peugeot has is hydrogen that they're working on, and in fact, with the technology that's coming down, I understand that General Motors has a car that will be a hydrogen tank on board, and it will be a very good no emissions car other than water. And Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, the Peugeot technology is a catalyst on board that, with a fuel tank of water and not even a tank of hydrogen, will produce the hydrogen as the car operates. This is the car that I want in Montana. I want to be the first to have a Peugeot in Montana. But my question, Mr. Chairman, is coming. What will I do, Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, if Peugeot does not qualify to California standards and wouldn't qualify to Montana standards under your bill, and I can't have a totally non-polluting car?
Good question, Mr. Chairman, Senator Perry. I can't imagine why a car that puts out no carbon dioxide, no carbon monoxide, no nitrogen oxides would be barred. And so I hope that this country and California isn't silly enough to do that.
Thank you, Senator.
A question for Mr. McGraw, please. Mr. Chairman and Mr. McGraw, we've heard about two sets of standards. One, the subject of this bill, another one that the auto industry feels like is more appropriate and that they can comply with. Can you contrast those and tell us why you think one is better than the other?
Well, the standards, the two sets of standards, I think the automobile industry is associating it with itself with now is the set of standards that they fought for 30 years. That's to begin with. That's the standards in the Energy Independence and Security Act passed in December of 2007. That does require a significant increase in corporate average fuel economy standards. As I said, I think the target by 2020 is 35 miles per gallon. The California vehicle emission standards that Senator Erickson's bill seeks to promote and advance in Montana for good reasons. Let's not forget, it's going to save Montanans hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm going to repeat that. Passing this bill, imposing these standards, will save Montanans money. Okay? Let's be real clear about that. At any rate, the passage of the California standards in 2020 would lead to about a 42 mile per gallon fuel efficiency.
One follow-up, please, if I might. So 42 compared to, what's the other number, sorry?
35, and you know, you can measure the benefits and the differences between these two standards in a number of different ways. By 2020, for example, the California standards, just in the 13 states in the District of Columbia that have already adopted these standards, by 2020 will lead to an 89% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the increased fuel economy standards in the Energy and Independent Security Act in 2007. I think the total amount of reductions is something like 500 million metric tons in 13 states by 2020 as a result of the California standards.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Senator Bear.
Thank you. I have a question for the sponsor, please, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrett.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Erickson, I just have a couple questions about the fiscal note, and it isn't general fund, it's state special revenue, and then the last note 8 is the board establishes air quality fees on an annual basis and would adjust the revenue collected to a level commensurate with the expenses necessary for the operation of this program. Is that the only source of funding for this bill?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrett, I apologize in my opening for not talking about an amendment that we have available that particularly the governor's office has brought to me to be able to get rid of the, basically it gets rid of the fiscal note and it gets rid of the problem that Don Allen had about whether or not there are, whether or not this would go off to standing facilities. You know, I had a sequestration bill that had to do with standing facilities. This is about cars and trucks, light trucks.
Okay, one follow-up. If we get rid of that source of funding, then what will we use?
Mr. Chairman, I would prefer to go to Paul Cartwright about that if I might. He's the one who has been working on this.
Redirect.
Mr. Cartwright, you can come forward, please, and address that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrett, excuse me. With the amendment, we believe the fiscal note should read 0. And basically, the rulemaking would be very simple. There would be no permits that would have to be modified or added to the mix.
Mr. Cartwright wrote about enforcement of it. Wouldn't there be a cost for enforcement?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrett, technically yes, probably no. I realize not everybody's been on car lots lately, but if you go out, you'll find that a number of cars meet California standards, current California standards right now. I bought a car a year and a half ago, it has a little ULEB sticker in the back. All the California standard compliant cars come with these stickers. I think that if you simply require manufacturers to swear that they will meet that, the first time they show up on a lot without a sticker, somebody reports it, and then it goes through the procedure. I don't think there'd be much of enforcement problems. And again, And this was curious. I guess I should talk to the manufacturers, the dealers later. But the number of California compliant cars we have in the state now is fairly high. So I'm not quite. Some of the testimony confused me, but that can be dealt with later.
Mr. Chairman, that leads to Section 6, and that says because SB 180 would establish greenhouse gases as regulated pollutants, the DEQ anticipates that up to 2,000 new sources would be subject to regulation through implementation of this bill using the DEQ oil and gas program as a model. What would pay for that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrett, that's the purpose of the amendment that was passed around by the talking press.
Okay.
That makes clear that this does not change into the other regulation, doesn't add sources, doesn't add pollutants. It basically focuses just on the tailpipes. And at that point, we believe the note would go to zero.
Thank you. Further questions? Further questions from the committees? Seeing none, Senator Erickson, would you like to close? Senator King. Oh, I'm sorry, Senator King. You gotta get your hand way up.
It's hard for me. Mr. Chairman, it's very hard to get my hand way up. Mr. Chairman, I guess a question for Mr. Cartwright.
Mr. Cartwright, please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator King.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cartwright, a lot of the assumptions are very onerous, and like we say, we have an amendment. How does the amendment take care of all these bad assumptions? I guess that's my question, without any cost to the state of Montana.
Mr. Chairman, Senator King, because of the way we drafted it to do that.
Mr. Chairman, follow-up, well, we have all these assumptions in it, and if it goes downstairs and you just get rid of all the assumptions, but then we pass the bill, and all of a sudden there's a significant cost to enforcement and regulation, I mean, how do we assure that that doesn't happen?
Mr. Chairman, Senator King, you actually raised a very good point, and one that I was very concerned about coming into this. That is, until the amendment is moved, there's not a fiscal note. There's nothing to write a fiscal note to, so we aren't able to present you a fiscal note right now, though I have what might be a copy of one fairly handy. So I share your concern. All I can tell is you must have some procedure for when there's amendments for getting fiscal notes before the whole bill voted on, or some kind of callback position. I don't know how you do that.
Well,
Mr. Chairman.
actually, I guess the rule is that once the amendment's placed on the bill, and you have your given amount of time to prepare a new fiscal note, and it needs to be requested by the committee chair if there's an amendment put on, or by the sponsor, or by the staff. I mean, anybody can request a corrected fiscal note, basically, but if you refuse to do it, then it becomes the committee chair or the committee staff who has the authority to demand it. But generally, the fiscal notes come forward readily, and as far as that's concerned, I don't see where there's a problem. Since it's an issue that's before the committee, that may make a difference in whether the amendment's adopted or not if we actually saw your assumptions for the fiscal note.
Mr. Chairman, Senator King, I guess I should have referred the question. We are prepared to do whatever is the pleasure of the committee, and whatever timetable is the pleasure of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, your answer piqued my interest in, do you have a revised fiscal note for the amendment already?
Mr. Chairman, on my computer downstairs, yes, I do.
Further questions from the committee? Further questions? Seeing none, Senator Erickson, I think I'll let you close this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the people who came to testify both for and against the bill. There was interesting testimony. Let me first of all say something about the fiscal note. The problem with the fiscal note was that it was written assuming that other parts of our economy would be regulated for carbon dioxide. That's not the case. This is a bill about cars and the California standard, and the one that we hope is going to be approved by the Obama administration, as I understand from the opponents, perhaps as early as the end of March. So, number one, there's no fiscal note. Number two, I think Paul Cartwright was on to something when he talked about, going down to buy your car. I know I keep getting ads from car dealers saying, buy this car, it meets the California standards. We already have a lot of cars meeting the California standards, and I must say that if we get to the place, which I hope we don't, where most of the states around us are on California standards and we aren't, we're going to be doubly hit. We're going to be hit because it's going to be hard to sell your car anyplace else other than in the state of Montana. And we're going to be hit because we won't be doing the job for our forest and our farmland. We need to be moving ahead on regulating carbon dioxide, and this is one of the best ways we can do, where we can actually do something about the carbon dioxide problem. I recommend it to pass, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Erickson, and thank all the members that I kept pushing to get through quickly. We still have one bill to go, and we do have 15 minutes left, and I appreciate your brevity. Thank you.